At the height of his career, Arthur Montenegro was the most powerful man in the room, until a voice shattered the celebration. "Dad, will you ever look at me?" In the spotlight's glare, a forgotten son asked for just one thing: to be seen. But was it too late? Before we dive in, comment below where you're watching from today. The Imperial Ballroom of the city's largest hotel was packed to capacity. Journalists, investors, and business leaders anxiously awaited the speech from the man of the hour. On stage, under bright spotlights, Arthur Montenegro, a visionary billionaire and CEO of Montenegro Holdings, adjusted his tie and smiled for the cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen, this merger will mark a new chapter in business history," Arthur announced with confidence, his voice resonating through the room. Applause erupted. Camera flashes lit up the room. The world hung on his every word as if they were gold. But then something unexpected happened. A weak, raspy voice broke through the silence of the crowd. "Son, when will you look at me?" The room froze. All eyes turned to the back of the ballroom, where an elderly man, bent by the weight of years, leaned on a cane, trembling slightly. His suit was worn, his thin white hair barely combed. His small, moist eyes desperately sought his son's gaze on stage. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. He knew that voice. It was Eduardo Montenegro, his father, a simple man who had spent his life working as a carpenter to ensure his son had everything. A man who once held his small hands and taught him to walk. A man who waited year after year for a call, a visit, a sign that he hadn't been forgotten. And now, in front of hundreds of people, he was begging for a glance. Arthur tried to speak, but his throat closed up. He hadn't seen his father in years. He avoided visits, ignored calls. He justified himself by saying he was too busy building an empire. But what was that entire empire worth compared to a father who just wanted to be seen? The audience waited. Journalists already held their phones up, ready to record his reaction. But none of that mattered anymore. Arthur stepped down from the stage. The firm steps that always made him look imposing now seemed hesitant, small, vulnerable. When he stopped in front of his father, he saw tired eyes full of hope. "Dad!" His voice broke. The old man smiled weakly as if this moment was all he needed. "Do you see me now, my son?" Arthur, the man who never showed emotion, fell to his knees and embraced him. And that night, the world didn't talk about the billion-dollar merger. They talked about a man who realized, perhaps too late, that life's greatest success wasn't in the numbers, but in the heart of the one who had been waiting for him all along. The following morning, sunshine streamed through the large windows of Arthur's penthouse apartment. He sat at his glass dining table, staring at his untouched breakfast while his assistant, Vanessa, rattled off his schedule for the day. The board meeting is at 10, followed by lunch with the investors from Dubai. The press conference has been rescheduled for 3, and your fiancée Sophia called twice already. She's not happy about last night's incident. Arthur barely heard her. His mind was still replaying the moment when his father appeared at the gala, the look in his eyes, the trembling in his voice. "Cancel everything," Arthur said suddenly. Vanessa stopped mid-sentence, her tablet still in hand. "Excuse me? Cancel everything for today and tomorrow too. But Mr. Montenegro, the merger can wait," Arthur said firmly. "My father has waited long enough." Vanessa had worked for Arthur for 5 years and had never seen him prioritize anything over business. She nodded slowly, trying to hide her surprise. "Of course. Where will you be if there's an emergency?" Arthur stood up, straightening his casual sweater. "I'm going to see my father." As Arthur drove his luxury car through the streets of the working-class neighborhood where he grew up, memories flooded back. The corner store where his father would buy him ice cream on payday. The park where they would play catch on Sundays. The small woodworking shop where his father had taught him to build his first birdhouse. He pulled up in front of a modest 2-story house. The paint was peeling and the front yard needed attention, but it was still the house where Arthur had grown up. He sat in his car for a long moment, gathering courage. When he finally knocked on the door, it was opened by a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. "Mrs. Ramirez?" Arthur recognized his father's neighbor, who had always been like an aunt to him. "Arthur." "Montenegro," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "Your father said you came to see him last night, but I didn't believe it. It's been so long." Arthur felt shame wash over him. "Is he here?" "He's in the backyard. Go on through." She stepped aside, then added, "He's not well, Arthur. The doctor says his heart is giving out. He doesn't have much time left." The words hit Arthur like a physical blow. He walked through the familiar house, noticing how little had changed. The same faded photographs on the walls, the same worn furniture. His father had lived in a time capsule while Arthur had been building his empire. In the backyard, Eduardo sat in an old wooden chair, working slowly on a small carving. His hands, once strong and steady, now trembled with each movement. He looked up when Arthur's shadow fell across his work. "You came," Eduardo said simply, a hint of surprise in his voice. "I came," Arthur replied, taking a seat on a nearby stool. "I should have come sooner." Eduardo shrugged. "You were busy building your life. That's no excuse." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. "What are you making?" Arthur finally asked, nodding toward the carving. Eduardo held up the small piece of wood. It was a miniature rocking chair, intricately detailed despite his shaking hands. "For Mrs. Ramirez's dollhouse collection. Keeps my hands busy." Arthur remembered how his father's hands had once been his livelihood, creating beautiful furniture that people would save for months to afford. "You always had magic in your hands." Eduardo smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "And you always had stars in yours. Always looking up, looking beyond." He set the carving down. "I knew you were meant for bigger things than this neighborhood." "Dad," Arthur began, struggling to find the right words, "Mrs. Ramirez told me about your heart." Eduardo waved dismissively. "Doctors always exaggerate. I'm still here, aren't I?" "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you call? Would you have answered?" Eduardo asked, not unkindly. The question hung in the air. They both knew the answer. "I want to help," Arthur said firmly. "I can get you the best doctors, the best treatment." "I don't need your money, Arthur," Eduardo interrupted. "I never did." "Then what do you need? Tell me anything." Eduardo looked at his son, really looked at him. "I need what every father needs from his son. Time. Not when I'm dying, but while I'm still living." Back at his office the next day, Arthur couldn't concentrate. His father's words echoed in his mind. Vanessa knocked on his door, entering with a stack of papers. "The merger documents need your signature by end of day," she said, placing them on his desk. "And Miss Sophia is in the lobby. She insists on seeing you." Arthur sighed. Sophia Vasquez, his fiancée of 1 year, was the daughter of a shipping magnate and the perfect match on paper. Beautiful, sophisticated, and from the right social circle. But in the 24 hours since seeing his father, Arthur had begun questioning everything about the life he had built. "Send her in," he said, bracing himself. Sophia swept into the office like a storm, her designer heels clicking on the marble floor. "Arthur, darling, what is going on? The whole city is talking about that scene at the gala." "Your father? Really?" After all these years of never mentioning him, Arthur stood up, suddenly irritated by her tone. "He's sick, Sophia. He's dying." Sophia's expression softened momentarily, then hardened again. "I'm sorry to hear that, but couldn't he have approached you privately? Did he have to cause such a spectacle?" "He tried," Arthur said quietly. "For years he tried to reach me. I was the one who shut him out." "Well, what are you planning to do about it now? We have the charity gala this weekend and the Montenegro Foundation dinner next week. You can't just disappear to play nursemaid." Arthur looked at his fiancée as if seeing her for the first time. Was this really the woman he wanted to spend his life with? Someone who saw his dying father as an inconvenience to their social calendar? "I'm moving him into my penthouse," Arthur said, the decision crystallizing as he spoke. "I've already arranged for a live-in nurse and the best cardiologist in the country." Sophia's perfectly made-up face registered shock. "Into our home? Arthur, be reasonable. We barely have enough room for my shoe collection as it is." "It's my home, Sophia," Arthur corrected her, "and there's plenty of room for what matters." The cold silence that followed told Arthur everything he needed to know about his relationship. Later that evening, Arthur pulled up to his father's house with a plan. He found Eduardo sitting in his favorite chair, watching an old Western on TV. "I want you to come stay with me," Arthur said without preamble. Eduardo looked up, surprised. "In that glass tower of yours?" "No, thank you. I'm comfortable here. But you'd have better care, better doctors, more comfort." "Son, at my age, comfort isn't about thread count or the view from the window. It's about being where your memories live." Arthur knelt beside his father's chair. "Then I'll stay here. I'll work remotely. My assistant can bring whatever I need." Eduardo studied his son's face. "For how long? A week? A month? Until the guilt wears off?" The words stung because there was truth in them. "Until you're better, or until the end, however long we have." Eduardo reached out a weathered hand and placed it on Arthur's cheek. "You have a life to live, son, a company to run, a fiancé waiting." "None of that matters if I've lost what's important," Arthur insisted. "Let me do this, Dad. Let me be your son again." Eduardo's eyes filled with tears. "You never stopped being my son, Arthur. Even when you forgot I was your father." That night, Arthur made some calls. By morning, a medical team arrived to evaluate Eduardo's condition. The prognosis was confirmed: congestive heart failure, advanced stage. Without intervention, he had months, maybe weeks. Despite Eduardo's protests, Arthur moved in that same day, converting the small guest room into a home office. He informed his board of directors that he would be working remotely indefinitely, ignoring their concerns about the pending merger. Sophia left 3 voicemails, each more demanding than the last, before finally sending a text that read simply, "Choose, Arthur. Your old life or your new one. You can't have both." As Arthur sat beside his father that evening, watching the same Western movie and sharing a simple dinner, he realized he had already made his choice. The empire could wait, the merger could wait, even Sophia could wait. For the first time in years, Arthur Montenegro was exactly where he needed to be, in his father's humble home, relearning what it meant to be a son. Mrs. Ramirez stopped by the next morning with a homemade casserole. She found Arthur at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, his laptop open in front of him. "So it's true," she said, placing the dish on the counter. "The great businessman has come home to roost." Arthur smiled at her. "It's good to see you too, Mrs. Ramirez." She sat down across from him, her wise eyes studying his face. "Your father never gave up on you, you know. Every birthday, every Christmas, he would say, 'Maybe this year Arthur will come.' He kept your room exactly as you left it." Arthur felt his throat tighten. "I was a fool." "Yes," she agreed bluntly, "but fools can become wise men if they open their eyes in time." She patted his hand. "He's still here, Arthur. That's what matters now." As weeks passed, Arthur fell into a routine. Mornings were for business calls and emails. Afternoons were spent with his father, often just sitting together in comfortable silence or listening to Eduardo's stories about the past. In the evenings, they would watch old movies, or Arthur would read to him when his father's eyes grew too tired. The merger stalled. The board threatened to remove him. Sophia eventually sent her engagement ring back in a courier package, with a note that read, "When you remember who you really are, call me." But something strange was happening to Arthur. The more time he spent in his childhood home, the more he felt like he was becoming who he really was, not losing himself. The ambition that had driven him for years was still there, but it was being tempered by something else, something that felt like peace. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Eduardo turned to his son. "I'm proud of you, Arthur." Arthur looked surprised. "For what? Abandoning my company? Losing my fiancé? Hiding out in my old neighborhood?" Eduardo shook his head. "For finding your way home before it was too late. Not many men have that courage." As darkness fell around them, Arthur realized that in trying to save his father, he might have saved himself instead. 2 months had passed since Arthur moved into his father's home. The small house that once felt confining to his younger self now felt like a sanctuary. The neighbors, who initially gawked at his expensive car and designer clothes, had gradually accepted his presence, greeting him by name when he took his morning walks with Eduardo. Arthur's phone rang as he prepared breakfast. It was Robert Chen, the head of his board of directors. Arthur, we can't keep postponing this. The Jiang Group is threatening to pull out of the merger entirely. We need you back at headquarters. Arthur glanced at his father, who was dozing in, his recliner, an oxygen tube in his nostrils. The doctors had increased his medication last week after a particularly bad episode. I can't leave right now, Robert, Arthur replied, keeping his voice low. Then you leave us no choice, Robert said with a sigh. The board is calling for an emergency vote to appoint an interim CEO. We've tried to be patient, but your company needs you. My father needs me more, Arthur said, firmly ending the call. He finished making breakfast, simple oatmeal with sliced bananas the way his father liked it, and gently woke Eduardo. Morning, Dad. Time to eat something. Eduardo opened his eyes. Slowly. His face had grown thinner over the weeks, his skin taking on a slightly yellowish tint that worried Arthur. Not hungry, Eduardo mumbled. Just a few bites. For me, Arthur coaxed, helping his father sit up. As Eduardo reluctantly ate, Arthur's mind raced. He knew the board wasn't bluffing. Montenegro Holdings, the company he had built from nothing, could slip from his grasp. Strangely, the thought didn't terrify him as it once would have. Bad news? Eduardo asked, noticing his son's distracted expression. Arthur forced a smile. Nothing I can't handle. Eduardo shook his head. No more lies between us, son. I'm old. Not stupid. Arthur set the bowl down. The board wants me back. The merger I was announcing the night you came to find me. It's falling apart. Then go, Eduardo said simply. I've taken enough of your time. You're not taking my time, Dad. I'm giving it freely. Eduardo reached for his son's hand, his bony fingers surprisingly strong. Arthur, listen to me. You've done enough. These past months, his voice faltered. They've been a gift, but I won't be the reason your life's work crumbles. It doesn't matter, Arthur insisted. It does, Eduardo countered. You think I want my legacy to be destroying what you've built? What kind of father would I be? Before Arthur could respond, the doorbell rang. When he opened it, he found Sophia, standing on the porch looking both uncomfortable and determined. Sophia? Arthur couldn't hide his surprise. What are you doing here? She stepped past him into the house, her designer outfit and perfectly styled hair a stark contrast to the modest surroundings. Your assistant told me where to find you, she said, her eyes taking in the living room with its worn furniture and family photos. Her gaze landed on Eduardo. Mr. Montenegro, I'm Sofia Vasquez. I don't believe we've been properly introduced. Eduardo nodded politely. The fiancé who returned the ring. I'd stand to greet you, but... He gestured to the oxygen tank. Sophia had the grace to look embarrassed. Former fiancé, she corrected, then turned to Arthur. Can we speak privately? Arthur led her to the kitchen, aware of how small and ordinary it must seem to someone accustomed to marble countertops and professional appliances. Robert called me, Sophia said without preamble. The board is moving against you, Arthur. They're going to vote you out by the end of the week if you don't return. Arthur leaned against the counter. I know. And you're just going to let that happen? After everything you've worked for? What would you have me do, Sophia? My father is dying. Sophia's expression softened. I understand that, but you're talking about losing your company, your legacy. Maybe my legacy isn't what I thought it was, Arthur said quietly. Sophia studied him for a long moment. You've changed. That's so terrible. She shook her head. No, it's just unexpected. She hesitated, then added, I may have been hasty in returning the ring. Seeing you now, committed to something beyond work, it's actually quite attractive. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Are you saying you want to try again? I'm saying I'd like to see where this new Arthur Montenegro might lead. She reached out to touch his face. I've missed you. Before Arthur could respond, a crash came from the living room, followed by labored breathing. They rushed in to find Eduardo on the floor, his oxygen tank toppled beside him. Dad! Arthur knelt beside him, helping him back into the chair. What happened? Tried to get water, Eduardo gasped. Dizzy. I'll call an ambulance, Sophia said, already pulling out her phone. At the hospital, Arthur paced the waiting room while doctors examined his father. Sophia sat nearby, her earlier poise replaced by genuine concern. You don't have to stay, Arthur told her. This could take hours. I want to stay, she said simply. Dr. Martinez, a cardiac specialist Arthur had hired, finally emerged. His expression was grave. Mr. Montenegro, your father's heart is failing more rapidly than we anticipated. The medication isn't working as effectively anymore. Arthur felt his stomach drop. What are our options? At his age and condition, a transplant is out of the question. We can adjust his medications again, but... Dr. Martinez hesitated. But what? It might be time to consider palliative care, making him comfortable rather than trying more aggressive treatments. Arthur shook his head. No, there must be something else. Experimental treatments, clinical trials. Arthur, Sophia interrupted gently. Maybe you should hear what your father wants. When they were allowed to see Eduardo, Arthur was shocked by how small and fragile his father looked in the hospital bed, connected to various monitors. They want to stop treatment, Arthur said, unable to keep the anger from his voice. But I won't let them. I'll find another doctor, another opinion. Son, Eduardo interrupted weakly. Stop. I can't just give up on you. Eduardo gestured for Arthur to come closer. You never gave up on me. You came back. That's all I ever wanted. He took a labored breath. Now I need you to let me go when it's time. Dad, please. Promise. Me, Eduardo insisted. Promise you'll respect my wishes. Arthur felt tears burning his eyes. I promise. Eduardo nodded, satisfied. And promise me something else. Don't throw away everything you've built. Your company needs you. Sophia, who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward. Your father is right, Arthur. You can balance both. I'll help you. Arthur looked between his father and Sophia, feeling torn. I don't want to leave you alone, Dad. I won't. Be alone, Eduardo said. Mrs. Ramirez checks on me every day and you can hire a nurse. He smiled weakly. Besides, I need something to look forward to. Your visits will give me a reason to stay strong. Later that evening, as Eduardo slept, Arthur and Sophia sat in the hospital cafeteria. He's right, you know, Sophia said, stirring her coffee. You don't have to choose between your father and your company, between your past and your future. Arthur looked at her with new eyes. The Sophia he had known before would never have sat for hours in a hospital waiting room or encouraged him to honor his father's wishes. When did you become so understanding? He asked. Sophia shrugged. Perhaps seeing you with your father made me realize what matters, or perhaps I was always capable of understanding, but you never gave me the chance. And us? Where do we stand? She reached for his hand. That depends on whether this new Arthur has room in his life for me. The new Arthur is still figuring things out, he admitted, but he'd like you to stick around while he does. The next morning, Arthur made a decision. He called Robert and arranged for a video conference with the board that afternoon. Then, he contacted Mrs. Ramirez and set up a schedule where she would check on Eduardo daily when he returned home. Finally, he hired 2 full-time nurses to provide round-the-clock care. I'll be back at headquarters tomorrow, he told Sophia as they sat beside Eduardo's hospital bed. But only for 3 days a week. The rest of the time I'll work from here. Sophia nodded. I've been thinking, what if we moved the wedding to your father's backyard? Something small, intimate, so he can be there without having to travel. Arthur looked at her in surprise. You'd give up the society wedding of the year? The one you've been planning for months? Some things are more important, she said, glancing at Eduardo. Besides, we can always have a grand reception later. For the first time in months, Arthur felt hope blossoming. Perhaps he could have it all. Not in the materialistic way he once defined it, but in a way that truly mattered. Eduardo was released from the hospital the following day with strict instructions for rest and medication. Arthur settled him back at home, ensuring he was comfortable before heading to the office. Walking into Montenegro Holdings after his long absence felt strange. Employees stared as he passed, whispering behind their hands. Robert met him at the elevator. Welcome back, he said, relief evident in his voice. The board is waiting. The boardroom fell silent as Arthur entered. These were the same people who had been plotting to remove him, yet he felt no anger, only clarity. Gentlemen, ladies, he began. I know many of you have questions about my absence and my commitment to this company. Victor Zhang, the head of the Chinese conglomerate they were hoping to merge with, spoke up. We were told you abandoned your post for personal reasons. Not abandoned, Arthur corrected. Prioritized. My father is dying, Mr. Zhang. In my culture, as in yours, family comes first. He laid out his plan. 3 days in the office, 2 days working remotely. Regular video conferences. A restructuring of leadership to distribute responsibilities more efficiently. And the merger? Robert asked. The terms need to be renegotiated, Arthur said firmly. The current proposal would eliminate too many jobs. I won't build my legacy on the backs of unemployed workers. The board members exchanged glances. This was not the same Arthur Montenegro who had left 2 months ago. To everyone's surprise, Victor Zhang smiled. In my country, a man who honors his father is a man who can be trusted. I find your new terms acceptable, Mr. Montenegro. By late afternoon, the framework for a new merger agreement was in place. Arthur called Eduardo to share the news. I'm proud of you, son, Eduardo said, his voice stronger than it had been in the hospital. Did you stand your ground like I taught you? Arthur smiled. I did, and it worked. That's my boy. Now, when are you bringing that fiancée of yours back? I like her more than I expected to, Arthur laughed. She surprised me too, Dad. She wants to have the wedding in your backyard. There was a pause on the line. Your mother would have liked that, Eduardo said finally, his voice thick with emotion. She always said you'd find your way back home, someday. As Arthur ended the call, Sophia entered his office. How did it go with the board? Better than expected, Arthur admitted. And I just told my dad about your idea for the wedding. He loves it. Sophia smiled, genuinely pleased. Good, because I've been thinking, after we're married, what if we renovated the house? Not to change it, but to make it more comfortable for your father. We could add a proper medical room, widen the doorways for his wheelchair. Arthur stared at her in amazement. You'd want to live there in my old neighborhood? Not full-time, she clarified. But a few days a week, yes, the penthouse isn't going anywhere. For the first time in years, Arthur felt truly at peace with his decisions. He had found a way to honor his father without sacrificing his future. And in Sophia, he had discovered depths he never knew existed. That evening, as they drove back to Eduardo's house, Arthur noticed his father sitting on the porch with Mrs. Ramirez, both of them laughing. It was a simple moment, but it filled Arthur with joy. He looks better, Sophia observed. He does, Arthur agreed, though he knew it was likely temporary. The doctor's prognosis hadn't changed, but for now his father was happy. And that was enough. As they joined Eduardo and Mrs. Ramirez on the porch, Arthur realized something important. In trying to escape his humble beginnings, he had been running from the very things that made him who he was. His father's work ethic, his mother's kindness, the sense of community that existed in this neighborhood. What are you thinking about? So, seriously? Eduardo asked, noticing his son's thoughtful expression. Arthur smiled. I was thinking that sometimes you have to leave home to understand what it really means. Eduardo nodded wisely. And sometimes you have to come back to remember who you really are. As the sun set over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across the yard, Arthur knew that whatever time he had left with his father, whether weeks, months, or by some miracle, years, he would treasure every moment. Because, in the end, it wasn't the empire he built that defined him. It was the legacy of love his father had built in him. Tell me again about how you met Mom, Arthur said, settling into the chair beside his father. I think Sophia should hear that story. Eduardo's eyes lit up, and as he began to speak, Arthur felt a sense of completeness he had never known in his corner office or luxury penthouse. This was where he belonged, at least for now. And whatever came next, he would face it with the strength his father had taught him and the love he had rediscovered. Over the next few weeks, Eduardo's house became a hub of activity. Contractors came and went, carefully renovating the small home to accommodate Eduardo's medical needs while preserving its character. Arthur insisted that his father's woodworking shop remain untouched, a sacred space of memories. The ramp looks good, Sophia said, inspecting the newly installed wheelchair access to the front porch. She had surprised everyone, including herself. By taking a hands-on approach to the renovations, her designer eye and practical suggestions had proven invaluable. Arthur wrapped an arm around her waist. "You're really committed to this, aren't you? To your father? To us?" "Yes," she said simply. "I've discovered there's more to life than charity galas and board meetings." Inside, Eduardo sat at the kitchen table with Mrs. Ramirez, looking through old photo albums. His health had stabilized somewhat with the new medication regimen, though everyone knew it was temporary. Still, he seemed more alive than he had in years, his eyes bright with purpose. "Ah, here you are," Eduardo called, as Arthur and Sophia entered. "I was just showing Maria my wedding photos. Your mother was so beautiful." Arthur sat down beside his father, studying the faded photograph of his parents on their wedding day. His mother, Elena, radiant in a simple white dress, and Eduardo young and strong looking at her as if she were the only person in the world. "You never talk about her," Arthur said quietly. Eduardo's smile faded. "After she died, it hurt too much. And then you left." He shrugged. "There was no one to talk to." Mrs. Ramirez patted Eduardo's hand. "He was lost without both of you. That's why I started checking on him every day." Arthur felt the familiar guilt washing over him. His mother had died of cancer when he was just 18. Instead of staying to support his father, he had fled to college and never really returned, using his studies and then his budding career as excuses to stay away from the painful memories. "She would have loved Sophia," Eduardo continued, breaking into Arthur's thoughts. "Strong women recognize each other." Sophia smiled, touched. "I wish I could have met her." "She's here," Eduardo said, tapping his chest. "In everything I made with these hands, every chair, every table, she inspired it all." Arthur looked around the house with new eyes, seeing his mother's influence in the carvings on the banister, the curved legs of the dining table, the delicate inlay on the coffee table. His father's artistry had been his tribute to her. Sophia seemed to read his thoughts. "We should display your father's work in the penthouse," she suggested, "and maybe commission new pieces for the office." Eduardo shook his head. "My hands aren't steady enough anymore." "But you could design," Arthur suggested, excitement building. "We could hire craftsmen to execute your designs. Montenegro Artisan Furniture, a new division of the company." Eduardo's eyes widened. "You would do that?" "It's brilliant," Sophia agreed. "Authentic, handcrafted furniture as a luxury brand. It fits perfectly with our sustainable business initiative." As they discussed the possibilities, Arthur's phone rang. It was Robert from the office. "Arthur, we have a situation," Robert said without preamble. "Victor Zhang's son, David, has arrived from Beijing. He's questioning the new merger terms and demanding to speak with you directly." Arthur sighed. "I'll be there in an hour." As he ended the call, he noticed Eduardo watching him. "Go," his father said. "Your company needs you." "We'll finish looking at these photos," Sophia assured him. Taking the seat Arthur vacated. At Montenegro Holdings, Arthur found the younger Zhang pacing the conference room. David Zhang was in his early 30s, with sharp features and an expensive suit that couldn't quite hide his aggressive demeanor. "Mr. Montenegro, finally," David said, his accent less pronounced than his father's. "I've been reviewing the merger proposal, and I find the new terms unacceptable." Arthur remained calm. "Your father seemed satisfied." "My father is sentimental," David said dismissively. "I am practical. The job protections you've insisted on cut too deeply into our projected profits." "Those jobs represent families," Arthur replied. "People who depend on steady employment to pay their mortgages and send their children to school, just as your employees in China do." David waved a hand impatiently. "Business is business. If you're suddenly developing a conscience, perhaps you're not the partner we thought you were." Something about the younger man's callous attitude reminded Arthur of himself just months ago. The man he had been before his father's reappearance. "In his life, Mr. Zhang," Arthur said carefully, "let me tell you a story about legacy. My father built furniture with his hands for 40 years. Each piece was crafted with integrity and designed to last generations. That's the kind of business I want to build now. One that doesn't sacrifice people for short-term profits." David looked unimpressed. Pretty words, but they don't change the financial reality. Actually, they do, Arthur countered, pulling out a folder. These are projections showing how employee retention and loyalty can increase productivity and innovation. The short-term costs of maintaining jobs will yield long-term benefits. For the next hour, Arthur outlined his vision for a merger that would strengthen both companies without devastating the workforce. To his surprise, David began to listen, asking increasingly thoughtful questions. "Your father is a wise man," Arthur concluded. "He saw what you're beginning to see, that business success and human values aren't mutually exclusive." By the end of the meeting, David had reluctantly agreed to reconsider his position. As they shook hands, he asked, "Your father, the carpenter, is he still alive?" "Yes," Arthur replied, "fighting heart failure, but still with us." David nodded thoughtfully. "My grandfather was a fisherman before our family's business grew. My father makes me visit him every New Year, though I always considered it a waste of time." He hesitated. "Perhaps I should call him more often." "You won't regret it," Arthur assured him. When Arthur returned home that evening, he found Sophia and Eduardo still at the kitchen table, but now surrounded by sketches and design ideas. Eduardo looked more animated than Arthur had seen him in weeks. "We've been brainstorming the furniture line," Sophia explained. "Your father has amazing ideas." Eduardo proudly showed Arthur a sketch of a rocking chair with intricate carvings. "I designed one like this for your mother when she was pregnant with you. She would rock you to sleep every night." Arthur's throat tightened. "I don't remember that." "It's still in the attic," Eduardo said. "A little worn, but solid. My best work." "We should bring it down," Arthur suggested. "Clean it up," Eduardo's eyes twinkled. "For grandchildren someday." Arthur and Sophia exchanged startled glances. They hadn't discussed children yet, though their wedding was now only weeks away. "Baby," Sophia said, a soft smile playing on her lips. Later that night, after Eduardo had gone to bed, Arthur and Sophia sat on the porch swing. "You were amazing today," Arthur said, getting him excited about the furniture designs, looking through old photos with him. "I enjoy it," Sophia admitted. "He has so many wonderful stories. Did you know he built a cradle for you before you were even born, and that he taught your mother to sand wood?" Arthur shook his head. "There's so much I never knew, or never bothered to learn." "You're learning now," Sophia pointed out. "That's what matters." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Sophia spoke again. "I've been thinking about my career." Arthur turned to her in surprise. Sophia was a successful art gallery owner, something she had always taken great pride in. "I want to scale back," she continued. "Maybe turn more of the day-to-day operations over to my assistant, Spendy. More time on the Montenegro artisan furniture line. Working with your father has shown me how much I missed having a creative outlet." "Are you sure?" Arthur asked. "Your gallery is part of who you are." "People change," she said simply. "I'm discovering I like this version of me better. Less concerned with appearances, more invested in creating something meaningful." Arthur kissed her gently. "I like this version of you too." The wedding plans progressed quickly. True to her word, Sophia arranged for a simple ceremony in Eduardo's backyard. She chose a classic, understated gown, and they limited the guest list to close friends and family. 3 days before the wedding, Arthur was working from his improvised home office when he heard a crash from Eduardo's bedroom. He rushed in to find his father on the floor gasping for breath. "Dad!" Arthur dropped to his knees beside him. "What happened?" "Can't breathe," Eduardo wheezed, his lips taking on a bluish tint. Arthur called for an ambulance, then helped his father onto the bed, adjusting the oxygen flow. Eduardo's pulse was rapid but weak, his skin clammy. "Hold on, Dad," Arthur pleaded. "Help is coming." At the hospital, Dr. Martinez delivered the news Arthur had been dreading. "The left ventricle is barely functioning. We can try more aggressive medications, but honestly, we're running out of options." "The wedding is in 3 days," Arthur said, his voice breaking. "He has to be there." Dr. Martinez looked sympathetic but realistic. "We'll do everything we can, but you should prepare yourself. It might be time to consider moving up the ceremony." "Arthur," called Sophia, who arrived within the hour, already making calls to rearrange the wedding. "We'll do it here tomorrow," she decided. The hospital chapel is small, but it will work. Sophia, you don't have to. Yes, I do, she interrupted firmly. Your father needs to see us married. Nothing else matters. When they told Eduardo the plan, he shook his head weakly. No. No hospital. Dad, you're not strong enough to leave, Arthur explained gently. My house, Eduardo insisted. Get married at home where your mother can be with us. Arthur looked at Dr. Martinez, who hesitated before speaking. It's against medical advice, but with proper transport and a medical team on standby, it would be for a very short time only. We'll make it happen, Sophia promised. The next 24 hours were a whirlwind of activity. The backyard ceremony was moved to the living room, where Eduardo could remain in a hospital bed. The guest list was cut even further. Sophia's elaborate gown was exchanged for a simple cream-colored dress she found at a local boutique. By late afternoon the following day, everything was ready. Mrs. Ramirez had filled the house with flowers. Sophia's assistant had arranged for a string quartet to play softly in the corner. A hospital transport team had carefully moved Eduardo to the makeshift headquarters in the living room, with a nurse monitoring his vital signs. Are you sure about this? Arthur asked Sophia one last time as they prepared in separate rooms. It's not the wedding you dreamed of. It's better, she replied, adjusting his tie. It has meaning. The ceremony was brief but emotional. Eduardo watched from his bed, oxygen tubes in his nose but a smile on his face, as Arthur and Sophia exchanged vows in front of the fireplace, where family photographs chronicled decades of memories. When it came time for the rings, Eduardo gestured weakly to Mrs. Ramirez, who handed Arthur a small wooden box. Your mother's, Eduardo explained softly. I've been saving it. Inside was a simple gold band, worn thin with years of love. Arthur looked at his father in surprise. Are you sure? Eduardo nodded. She would want Sophia to have it. Sophia's eyes filled with tears as Arthur slipped the ring onto her finger, alongside the diamond engagement ring he had given her. I'll treasure it always, she promised Eduardo. As the small gathering of guests enjoyed cake and champagne in the dining room, Arthur sat beside his father, who seemed both exhausted and content. Happy? Eduardo asked. Very, Arthur assured. Him. Are you comfortable? Should we call the transport team? Eduardo shook his head. Not yet. Want to enjoy a little longer? He reached for Arthur's hand. You found a good woman. Thanks to you, Arthur said. If you hadn't shown up at that gala, always knew you'd remember what matters, Eduardo said, his breathing labored but his eyes clear. Your mother would be proud. Later that evening, as the medical team prepared to transport Eduardo back to the hospital, he asked for a moment alone with the newlyweds. I have a wedding gift, he said, his voice stronger than it had been all day. From beneath his blanket, he pulled out an envelope. Open it. Inside was a deed. Arthur looked at it in confusion. The house. Dad, this is your home. Now it's yours. Eduardo replied. Both of you to live in or sell, your choice. We would never sell it, Sophia said quickly. But it's your legacy, Arthur added. Eduardo smiled. No, son, you are my legacy. This is just a place to keep memories. As the transport team wheeled Eduardo to the waiting ambulance, Arthur and Sophia stood on the porch, arms around each. Other? Do you think he'll... Sophia couldn't finish the question. I don't know, Arthur admitted, but he got to see us married. That seemed to be what he was holding on for. That night, as they lay in the guest bedroom of what was now their house, Arthur found himself unable to sleep. The day had been perfect in its imperfection, full of love and meaning rather than spectacle. What are you thinking about? Sophia asked, curling against him. That I spent years chasing success, never realizing I was running away from what really matters. Sophia propped herself up on one elbow. And what matters? This, Arthur said simply. Family, home, love that doesn't depend on achievement. So, what now? She asked. For us, I mean. Arthur considered the question. We keep the house, like you said, make it our weekend home. Launch the furniture line with my father's designs. Build something that honors his legacy. And children? Sophia asked tentatively. Arthur smiled. Definitely children, who will learn to make birdhouses in their grandfather's workshop, even if he's only with them in spirit. Sophia laid her head on his chest. I like that future. Me too, Arthur whispered, finally feeling peace settle over him. In the morning, they would face whatever came next, Eduardo's declining health, the challenges of merging their two very different lives, the complications of running a global company while honoring the values Arthur had rediscovered. But for now, in this house filled with memories, they had found what both had been searching for, a love that felt like home. And in the hospital across town, Eduardo Montenegro slept peacefully, his work complete. He had guided his son back to what mattered most. Whatever happened now, his legacy was secure, not in the furniture he had crafted with his hands, but in the values he had instilled in his son's heart. The next morning, Arthur's phone rang just after dawn. It was Dr. Martinez. Mr. Montenegro, the doctor said, his voice grave. You should come to the hospital right away. Your father is asking for you. Arthur and Sophia dressed quickly, the joy of their wedding day giving way to the somber reality of Eduardo's condition. As they drove through the quiet morning streets, Arthur prepared himself for what might be a final goodbye. At the hospital, they found Eduardo awake but very weak, his breathing shallow despite the oxygen. There you are, he said when Arthur and Sophia entered, his voice barely above a whisper. My family. Arthur sat beside the bed, taking his father's hand. We're here, Dad. Eduardo smiled faintly. I had a dream. Your mother was waiting for me. Said it's almost time. Sophia moved to the other side of the bed, her eyes filled with tears. Eduardo reached for her hand as well. Take care of each other, he said. And remember what I taught you. About furniture making? Arthur asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Eduardo shook his head slightly. About love, how to build something that lasts. For the next few hours they sat with Eduardo, sometimes talking softly, sometimes just being present. Nurses came and went, adjusting medications, checking vital signs. Dr. Martinez stopped by, his expression confirming what they already knew. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Eduardo seemed to rally slightly. Tell me about the furniture line, he requested, so Arthur and Sophia described their plans, showing him sketches on Sophia's tablet, discussing wood types and techniques. Eduardo nodded, occasionally offering a suggestion or correction. The Montenegro legacy, he said with satisfaction. Not bad, for a simple carpenter. The best carpenter, Arthur corrected, who taught his son the most important lessons even. When his son was too stubborn to listen, Eduardo squeezed Arthur's hand. Not stubborn, just finding your way. His eyes began to drift closed. I'm tired now. Rest, Dad, Arthur said softly. We'll be here. Eduardo nodded slightly, his eyes remaining closed. His breathing evened out as he fell asleep. Dr. Martinez returned later, checking Eduardo's vital signs. His body is shutting down, he explained, quietly to Arthur and Sophia. It could be hours or days, but he's not in pain. Thank you, Arthur said, grateful for the doctor's honesty and care. As evening approached, Mrs. Ramirez arrived, bringing homemade food that neither Arthur nor Sophia felt like eating. She sat with them for a while, sharing stories about Eduardo, from the years when Arthur had been absent. He never stopped talking about you, she told Arthur. Every achievement, every news article about your company, he kept them all. There's a box in his closet full of clippings. Arthur hadn't known. The thought of his father carefully saving articles about him, proud despite the distance between them, made his throat tighten with emotion. As night fell, Eduardo's breathing became more labored. The night nurse increased his medication, ensuring his comfort. Arthur and Sophia maintained their vigil, one on each side of the bed. Talk to him, the nurse suggested. Hearing is often the last sense to go. Let him know you're here. So Arthur began to speak, his voice low and steady. Dad, I want you to know how much you've changed my life these past months. You helped me remember who I really am, who I want to be. He swallowed hard. And I promise to live by what you've taught me, to value what truly matters, to build a legacy worthy of your name. Sophia wiped tears from her eyes. Eduardo, I never had a father who cared the way you do. Thank you for welcoming me into your family, for trusting me with your son's heart. I promise to honor that trust. As midnight approached, Eduardo's breathing grew more irregular. The nurse checked his monitors and silently adjusted his medication again. It's okay, Dad, Arthur whispered, sensing the end was near. You can rest now. Mom is waiting, like you said. Shortly after midnight, Eduardo Montenegro took his last breath. He left this world, as he had lived in it, with quiet dignity, surrounded by love. In the stillness that followed, Arthur felt both profound loss and deep gratitude. His father was gone, but the connection between them had been restored. The lessons Eduardo had tried to teach him throughout his life had finally taken root. As dawn broke, Arthur and Sophia left the hospital and drove back to the house, Eduardo's house, now theirs. They sat on the porch swing, watching the sunrise, paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. What do we do now? Sophia asked quietly. Arthur took a deep breath. We honor him. We launch the furniture line. We live part of our life here in this house, rooted in what matters. He turned to her. And we start our family when we're ready. Sophia leaned against him. He'll be with us in everything we build together. Yes, Arthur agreed. That's what legacy really means. In the weeks that followed, Arthur would find unexpected comfort in his father's workshop, running his hands over the tools Eduardo had used for decades. He would discover the box of newspaper clippings Mrs. Ramirez had mentioned, each one carefully dated and preserved. He would sit in the rocking chair his father had made for his mother, feeling a connection to both parents that transcended their absence. And he would understand, finally, that his father had given him one last, precious gift, the chance to say goodbye, to make amends, to restore what had been broken between them. Eduardo Montenegro, the forgotten father, would never be forgotten again. 6 months had passed since Eduardo's funeral. The small cemetery had been filled with people, neighbors, who had known him for decades, craftsmen who had admired his work, and, to Arthur's surprise, business associates who had come to support him in his grief. Now, on a crisp autumn morning, Arthur stood in his father's workshop, running his fingers over the smooth surface of a half-finished rocking chair. Eduardo had begun it before his health failed completely. Arthur had spent the past several weekends learning to complete it, guided by his father's detailed notes and Mrs. Ramirez's memory of Eduardo's techniques. It's looking good, Sophia said from the doorway. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail, a far cry from the polished society woman she had been a year ago. Your father would be proud, Arthur smiled. I hope so. It's harder than it looks. The best things usually are, she replied, coming to stand beside him. She ran her hand along the curved arm of the chair. We've received another order for the Eduardo collection. 5 complete bedroom sets for that boutique hotel in Chicago. The Montenegro artisan furniture line, launched just 3 months after Eduardo's death, had been an immediate success. Using Eduardo's designs and techniques, they had created a collection that combined traditional craftsmanship with modern aesthetics. Each piece bore a small brass plate with Eduardo's signature, preserving his legacy. That's the 3rd hotel this month, Arthur noted. We'll need to hire more craftsmen. Already on it, Sophia assured him. I've been interviewing carpenters from the trade school, found 2 who show real promise. Arthur put his arm around her waist, pulling her close. What would I do without you? Fortunately, you'll never have to find out, she teased, then grew serious. The doctor called. She can see us next Tuesday. Arthur nodded, a mixture of hope and anxiety washing over him. After months of trying, they had yet to conceive a child. The disappointment each month was becoming harder to bear, especially for Sophia. It will happen when it's meant to, he said, repeating the phrase they had both clung to. Sophia rested her head on his shoulder. I know, I want to give you a family. We already are a family, Arthur reminded her. You and me. Everything else is a bonus. Later that afternoon, they drove to Montenegro Holdings for the quarterly board meeting. The company had undergone significant changes in recent months. Following the successful merger with Zhang Industries, Arthur had implemented a more balanced approach to business, one that prioritized sustainable growth over rapid expansion and employee welfare over short-term profits. Not everyone had been pleased with the new direction. Several board members had resigned in protest. But to Arthur's surprise, profits had actually increased as employee turnover decreased and innovation flourished in the more supportive environment. As Arthur and Sophia entered the boardroom, they were greeted by Victor Zhang and his son David, now key allies in Arthur's vision for the company. "Arthur, Sophia," Victor said warmly, "how is the furniture business?" "Thriving," Sophia replied. "We can barely keep up with orders." David, who had initially been so skeptical of Arthur's values-based approach, nodded appreciatively. "My grandfather's rosewood table arrived last week. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. He hasn't stopped talking about it." The meeting proceeded smoothly until Robert Chen raised an unexpected concern. "There's a rumor that Carson Investments is planning a hostile takeover," he announced, referring to an aggressive investment firm known for dismantling companies and selling off their parts. "They've been quietly acquiring shares," Arthur frowned. "How much do they control?" "Nearly 15%, Robert replied. "Not enough for control, but concerning." "What do they want?" David asked. "What they always want," Arthur replied grimly. "Quick profits without regard for consequences. They'll strip the company, fire half the workforce and sell off the valuable parts." Victor Zhang looked troubled. "This merger has been good for both our companies. We cannot allow vultures to destroy what we've built." "We won't," Arthur assured him, though his mind was racing. Carson Investments was notorious for its ruthless tactics. Fighting them would be a significant challenge. After the meeting, Arthur and Sophia walked to his office, discussing strategies to counter the potential threat. "We could implement a poison pill," Sophia suggested, referring to a defensive measure that would make a takeover prohibitively expensive. Arthur shook his head. "That's a short-term solution. We need to think bigger." As they entered his office, Arthur paused. Sitting on his desk was an old wooden box he recognized immediately. It was one of his father's early creations, a jewelry box he had made for Arthur's mother. "Where did this come from?" he asked his assistant, who was arranging files nearby. "It was delivered this morning," she replied. "There's a note inside." Arthur opened the box carefully. Inside was a folded piece of paper in his father's handwriting. It was dated just weeks before his death. "Son, by the time you read this, I will be gone. Mrs. Ramirez promised to give you this box when enough time had passed for the sharpness of grief to soften. Inside the false bottom, yes, there is one, press the left corner, is something I've kept safe for you. When we build, we must begin with a solid foundation. Your mother taught me that. Now I pass that lesson to you. Love, Dad." Arthur's hands trembled slightly as he pressed the left corner of the box. With a soft click, the bottom panel slid aside, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small leather pouch. Arthur emptied its contents onto his desk. Old stock certificates for a company he didn't recognize, along with a deed and several yellowed photographs. "What is it?" Sophia asked, peering over his shoulder. "I'm not sure," Arthur admitted, examining the stock certificates. They were for a company called Pioneer Lumber, dated nearly 50 years earlier. One of the photographs showed a young Eduardo standing in front of a lumber yard with another man. On the back was written, "Eduardo and Frank, Pioneer Lumber, 1972. "I need to make some calls," Arthur said. Over the next several days, Arthur pieced together a surprising story. Pioneer Lumber had been a small but successful company, co-founded by his father and a friend named Frank Carson in the early 1970s. When Arthur's mother became ill, Eduardo had sold his half of the business to Frank to pay for her medical treatments. Frank Carson had gone on to build the company into Carson Investments, the very firm now threatening Montenegro Holdings. "It can't be coincidence," Sophia said when Arthur shared his discovery. "Carson must know the connection." Arthur nodded slowly. "And these stock certificates, according to my lawyers, they represent ownership rights that were never properly transferred. My father still owned 5% of the original company, which would translate to a small but significant stake in Carson Investments today. Enough. For a seat at the table, Sophia realized. Exactly, Arthur confirmed. My father left me the foundation for a defense he knew I would eventually need. The following week, Arthur requested a meeting with James Carson, Frank's son, who now ran Carson Investments. They met in a private dining room at the city's most exclusive restaurant. James Carson was a cold, calculating man in his 50s, with sharp features and assessing eyes. I was curious when you called, Montenegro. I assume you want to negotiate. Surrender terms. Arthur smiled calmly. Actually, I came to discuss my father, Eduardo Montenegro. I believe he was your father's business partner once. Something flickered in Carson's eyes. Ancient history. What's your point? Arthur placed the stock certificates and photographs on the table. My point is that my father never relinquished certain rights to the original company, rights that my attorneys tell me are still valid. Carson's face hardened. That's impossible. My father bought him out completely. Not according to these documents, Arthur replied, and not according to this. He slid across the table a letter he had found among his father's papers, a handwritten note from Frank Carson, promising Eduardo that he would always have a place in the company if he ever wanted to return. Your father was an honorable man, Arthur continued. He kept his word by maintaining my father's ownership stake on the books, even if my father never exercised his rights. I've confirmed this with company records. Carson's confident demeanor faltered. What do you want? I want you to call off the takeover attempt, Arthur said simply. Montenegro Holdings is not for sale, and if I refuse, then I'll exercise my rights as a stakeholder in Carson Investments. I'll bring this story of how my father sacrificed his business to save my mother, and how your father honored that sacrifice, to every financial publication in the country. Arthur leaned forward. The market values stories, Carson. This one would cast you as the villain trying to destroy the company founded by the son of your father's friend. Carson was silent for a long moment. My father spoke of your father occasionally, he finally said. Said he was the best man he ever knew. Said he gave up everything for love. He shook his head. I never understood that. That's why you'll never truly succeed, Arthur replied, not unkindly. You build without heart. My father taught me that anything built that way eventually collapses. 2 days later, Carson Investments announced it was divesting its shares. In Montenegro Holdings, the threat was over. When Arthur told Sophia, she embraced him tightly. Your father is still protecting you. He always was, Arthur realized, even when I didn't see it. Spring arrived, bringing new beginnings. The Eduardo collection had expanded to include office furniture, and the first Montenegro artisan furniture showroom had opened downtown. Arthur divided his time between running his company and working in his father's shop, finding unexpected peace in the rhythm of woodworking. One evening, as Arthur and Sophia sat on their porch swing at Eduardo's house, their weekend home, Sophia placed Arthur's hand on her stomach. Feel that, she whispered. Arthur waited, then felt a slight flutter beneath his palm. His eyes widened. Is that? Sophia nodded, her eyes shining. I confirmed it yesterday. We're having a baby. Arthur pulled her into his arms, overcome with emotion. Dad always said it would happen when the time was right. He was a wise man, Sophia agreed, wiping away happy tears. I was thinking, if it's a boy, we could name him Eduardo. And if it's a girl, Elena, after my mother, Arthur suggested as twilight deepened around them. Arthur felt a profound sense of continuity. His father's house would soon welcome a new generation. The family legacy would continue, not just in the business empire he had built, but in the values his father had instilled in him. Values he would now pass on to his child. In Eduardo's workshop, Arthur had begun crafting a cradle, using the tools his father had used to build his own cradle decades earlier. The circle was complete. 4 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Arthur sat in his office at Montenegro Holdings, reviewing the quarterly reports. The company was thriving. The merger with Zhang Industries had exceeded expectations, and the furniture line was expanding internationally. His assistant knocked on the door. Mr. Montenegro, your wife is on line 1. She says it's urgent. Arthur's heart raced as he picked up the phone. "Sophia, is everything okay?" "Better than okay," she laughed. "I just had my ultrasound. Arthur, we're having twins, a boy and a girl." Arthur sat back in his chair, momentarily speechless. "Twins, are you sure?" "The doctor showed me both heartbeats," Sophia confirmed. "Eduardo and Elena, just as we planned. Your father is probably up there right now, very proud of himself." Arthur laughed, imagining his father's satisfied smile. He always did like efficiency. That weekend, Arthur worked late into the night in his father's workshop, modifying his cradle designed to accommodate 2 babies instead of 1. As he carefully shaped the wood, he felt his father's presence guiding his hands. "I wish you could be here to see them, Dad," he said aloud to the empty room. "To teach them what you taught me." A warm breeze suddenly rustled through the open window, carrying the scent of wood shavings and varnish, his father's scent. Arthur smiled, taking it as a sign. Eduardo was with him in the skills he had passed down, in the values he had instilled, in the love he had shown. 2 months before the babies were due, Arthur was surprised by a visit from David Zhang at his office. "I heard congratulations are in order," David said. "Twins, I understand?" Arthur nodded proudly. "Due in January." David hesitated, then placed a small wrapped package on Arthur's desk. "My grandfather asked me to give you this. He said your father would approve." Inside was an intricately carved wooden box containing 2 jade amulets on red silk cords. "They're protection charms," David explained. "A tradition in my family. 4 generations. My grandfather said that business partners should share in each other's joy." Arthur was touched by the gesture. "Please thank him for me. This means a great deal." He also said, David added with a smile, that children are the most profitable long-term investment a man can make. On a snowy January morning, Arthur paced the hospital waiting room. Sophia had gone into labor 3 weeks early, and the doctors had decided on an emergency C-section due to complications. Mrs. Ramirez sat nearby, knitting tiny blankets and murmuring prayers. "Your father paced just like that when you were being born," she told Arthur. "Some things pass down without even trying." After what seemed like an eternity, the doctor emerged, smiling. "Congratulations, Mr. Montenegro. Your wife and both babies are doing well." In the recovery room, Arthur found Sophia propped up in bed, a tiny bundle in each arm. She looked exhausted but radiant. "Meet your children," she said softly. Arthur carefully took his son in his arms first. Eduardo Montenegro II had a shock of dark hair and his grandfather's strong chin. Then he cradled his daughter Elena, who was smaller but already showing signs of her mother's delicate features. "They're perfect," he whispered, overwhelmed by love. Sophia watched him, her eyes soft. "Your father would be so proud of you, Arthur. Not because of the business or the money, but because of the man you've become." "Because of him," Arthur acknowledged. "Everything good in me came from him." 1 month later, Arthur brought the twins to his father's grave for the first time. It was a clear, cold day, the cemetery peaceful under a light dusting of snow. He sat on the bench beside the simple headstone, a baby carrier on each side of him. "Dad, I brought some people for you to meet," he said, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Your grandchildren, Eduardo and Elena." As if on cue, baby Eduardo opened his eyes, blinking up at the winter sky. "He has your eyes," Arthur told the headstone, "and Elena has Mom's smile, at least according to Mrs. Ramirez." He told his father about the twins' birth, about how the furniture business was expanding, about the renovation of the workshop to make it safer for when the children were old enough to learn woodworking. "I understand now," Arthur said finally, "what it means to be a father. The way you look at your child and see all your hopes and dreams transferred to them. The way you'd give up everything just to see them smile." He placed a small, carved wooden bird on top of the headstone, the first project he had completed entirely on his own in his father's workshop. "I promise to teach them everything you taught me," he vowed. "About wood and craftsmanship, yes, but more importantly, about love and sacrifice and what really matters in life." As he gathered up the babies to leave, Arthur felt a sense of peace wash over him. The circle was complete. The forgotten father had become the foundation of a new beginning. That evening, as Arthur rocked his son to sleep in the cradle he had built, Sophia came in with Elena, already drowsy in her arms. "I was thinking," she said quietly, "about the house." "What about it?" Arthur asked, gently placing Eduardo in the cradle. "We should live here full-time," Sophia suggested. "The penthouse is beautiful, but this is home. This is where your father's spirit lives, where our children should grow up." Arthur looked around the modest bedroom that had once been his own, now transformed into a nursery for the twins. The walls were adorned with photographs: Eduardo teaching a young Arthur to use a hammer, Arthur's mother in the garden, Arthur and Sophia on their wedding day. And most recently, 4 generations of Montenegros in a newly framed portrait: Eduardo in an old photograph, Arthur and the twins. "You're right," he agreed. "This is where we belong." Later, after the babies were asleep, Arthur and Sophia sat on the porch swing, wrapped in blankets against the winter chill. The same swing where Eduardo had spent countless evenings watching the neighborhood change around him. "Your father told me something once," Sophia said, "before we were married. He said that success isn't measured in money or power, but in the love you leave behind." Arthur nodded, throat tight with emotion. "He was the richest man I've ever known, by that measure. And now you are too," Sophia said, squeezing his hand. "The empire you're building now will last generations." Above them, stars filled the clear night sky, timeless and eternal. In the nursery, Eduardo and Elena slept peacefully, unaware of the legacy they had inherited, not of wealth or status, but of values and love and the knowledge that they would never be forgotten. Arthur Montenegro, once so focused on building skyscrapers of steel and glass, had learned from his father the art of building something far more enduring: a family bound by love, a legacy of compassion, and a home where memories lived in every carefully crafted piece of wood. The forgotten father had ensured that his son would remember what truly mattered. And in doing so, Eduardo Montenegro had built his greatest masterpiece: a son who understood that the most precious inheritance is not what we have, but who we become. As Arthur and Sophia eventually went inside, arm in arm, they left the porch. Light on, a family tradition Eduardo had maintained for years. For even when he had no expectation of his son's return, it shone into the night, a beacon of welcome, signaling to all who passed that this house was more than just a building. It was a home where love resided, where memories lived, where a father's legacy continued through his son, and where, thanks to Eduardo Montenegro's final lesson, no one would ever be forgotten again. The end.